3 years before the morning that would change everything. Daniel Brooks was fired in less than 10 minutes. He lost the career he had built over 20 years, the respect of people who once called him family, and almost every certainty he had ever trusted. He did not fight back, and he did not ask for revenge. Instead, with the last of his savings, he bought a forgotten bakery in a small town nobody talked about, hoping only to begin again in silence. He could not have known that on the very day his bakery became famous across the state, the woman who once signed away his future would walk through its door and stand face to face with the man she had destroyed. Daniel had spent 2 decades inside Hayes Food Group, rising from a warehouse floor supervisor to the company's most trusted operations director. He was the man executives called when a shipment failed, when a factory line stalled, when numbers did not add up and nobody could explain why. Workers on every floor knew his name, not because he demanded respect, but because he gave it freely, remembering birthdays, covering shifts, staying late without complaint when someone needed him. He built the company's supply chain from nothing into something that ran with quiet precision, and for years, no one questioned whether he belonged at the top of it. Victoria Hayes, the young chief executive who had inherited the company from her father, trusted him more than she trusted almost anyone else on her leadership team. And for a long time, that trust was well placed. He had joined the company at 22, fresh out of a state college with no connections and no illusions about how far ambition alone could carry a man. He worked nights unloading trucks before he ever set foot in an office. And he learned the business from the ground up, one broken pallet and one missed delivery at a time. By the time he was 40, he could walk onto any factory floor in the company's network and know within minutes whether something was wrong, simply by the sound of the machines and the rhythm of the workers moving around them. He was not a man who chased titles, but the titles found him anyway, because competence, in the end, is difficult to ignore. What neither he nor Victoria saw coming was Michael Stone, the ambitious chief financial officer, who had spent months quietly siphoning millions from supplier contracts, burying the losses under falsified reports and forged signatures. Michael was careful, patient, and calculating, the kind of man who smiled easily in meetings and remembered everyone's coffee order, while behind closed doors he moved numbers the way a magician moves coins, always one step ahead of anyone watching too closely. When auditors finally noticed the discrepancies, he made certain that every trail led away from himself and directly toward Daniel, rewriting contracts weeks after they were signed, inserting Daniel's name into approvals he had never actually given. By the time the discrepancies reached Victoria's desk, the story had already been written for her, and she had no reason yet to doubt it. She was 38 years old, still proving herself to a board of directors who had watched her inherit a company she had not built, and she had learned, perhaps too well, that decisiveness was often mistaken for strength in rooms full of men twice her age. When Michael handed her the folder of manufactured evidence, thick with numbers and dates that all seemed to point in the same direction, she did not see a trap. She saw an opportunity to prove that she would not hesitate, even when the decision was difficult, even when it meant cutting loose a man who had spent 20 years serving the company faithfully. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Victoria sat across from Daniel with the folder open in front of her, her face unreadable, her voice clipped and professional in the way executives are trained to sound when delivering bad news quickly. She did not ask him to explain the numbers. She did not ask if the signatures were his. She simply told him that the board had lost confidence in his leadership, that his position was being terminated effective immediately, and that security would help him collect his belongings. Daniel opened his mouth once, ready to defend 2 decades of work with a single sentence, but the look on her face told him nothing he said would matter that day. He tried once more anyway, because 20 years deserved at least one more sentence. He told her, quietly, that he had never approved the contracts she was pointing to, that his signature on those pages did not look like his own, if she looked closely enough. Victoria did not look closely. She closed the folder, thanked him for his years of service in a tone that sounded rehearsed even to her own ears, and stood to signal that the conversation was finished. It was the fastest ending to the longest chapter of his life, and there was nothing left for him to do but stand, straighten his jacket, and walk out the door he had walked through 10,000 times before. He packed 20 years of his life into a cardboard box that barely held it all. A coffee mug with a chip in the handle, a framed photograph from a company picnic, a stack of commendation letters that no longer meant anything to anyone but him. He walked past desks where people avoided his eyes, past the security guard who could not look at him either, past the break room where he had once organized birthday celebrations for employees whose names Victoria had never learned. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked him what had happened. In a company of thousands, he walked out through the same glass doors he had walked through 10,000 times before. And not a single person followed him to ask if he was all right. Outside, he stopped on the sidewalk and turned to look at the building one final time, its windows catching the gray afternoon light, indifferent to everything that had just happened inside it. Cars moved past on the street behind him. People hurried along the sidewalk with their heads down against the wind, and none of it paused for even a moment to acknowledge that a man's entire career had just quietly ended a few floors above them. He thought about calling someone, a friend from another department, a former colleague who might offer a word of comfort, but he realized, standing there with a cardboard box in his arms, that he did not know who among them would actually pick up the phone. He did not raise his voice, and he did not curse the woman who had just ended his career without a single question. He simply stood there for a long moment, watching the reflection of the city move across the glass, and said the only thing that felt true. One day, he told himself quietly, the truth would speak for itself, whether anyone was there to listen or not. Then he turned and walked away, carrying his box down a street that no longer had anywhere for him to go. And somewhere behind him, inside the building he would never enter again, Victoria Hayes had already moved on to the next item on her calendar. 3 months later, Daniel had sold nearly everything he owned. The apartment went first, then the car, then most of the furniture that had filled a life he no longer recognized as his own. Severance offered little comfort once his name had quietly circulated through the industry, whispered from one hiring manager to another, always attached to a scandal he had never actually caused. No one called him back for interviews. No one wanted to take a chance on a man whose reputation had been dismantled in 10 minutes, regardless of how many years he had spent earning it. What remained after the debts were settled was barely enough to start over, and starting over was the only option left to him. He chose a small town nearly 4 hours from the city, a place where nobody had heard of Hayes Food Group or the operations director who once ran its factories, a place with quiet streets and slower mornings where a man could disappear into ordinary life if he wanted to. He drove there with everything he owned packed into the back of a rented car, watching the skyline shrink in his mirror until it disappeared entirely behind rolling hills and open farmland. There was something almost peaceful in the anonymity of it, the knowledge that in this new place, no one would look at him and see the man who had been publicly humiliated after 20 years of loyal service. It was there, on a corner that had once been the busiest block in town, that he found a bakery that had been open for more than 70 years and was now just weeks from closing its doors for good. Its windows were fogged with age, its sign faded to a whisper of its original color. And behind the counter stood Evelyn Carter, 68 years old, who had run the shop since she was younger than Daniel was now. She told him plainly, without asking for sympathy, that she simply did not have the strength left to keep going, that her hands ached too much to knead dough before sunrise, that the town had moved on to newer places with brighter signs and easier parking. Evelyn watched him carefully as he walked through the shop, running his hand along the worn wooden counter, studying the old brick ovens along the back wall as though they held some answer he was searching for. She asked him, not unkindly, why a man in a pressed shirt with city hands would want to buy a dying bakery in a town where the biggest excitement of the week was the farmers' market on Saturday mornings. Daniel did not have a clean answer for her. Only the truth, that he had nothing left to lose and nowhere else that wanted him. And that something about the smell of old flour and warm brick reminded him of a kitchen from a long time ago. Daniel did not know how to bake a single loaf of bread. He had spent his career managing spreadsheets and supply routes, not flour and yeast, and there was no version of his old resume that explained why a man like him would want to buy a dying bakery in a town he had never set foot in before. But something in him remembered his mother's voice from a kitchen decades earlier, telling him that a good loaf of bread could make a person believe, even for a moment, that things might still turn out fine. He used every dollar he had left to buy the shop, the ovens, the worn wooden counters, and the small apartment above it that would become his home. The first morning he opened the doors. Only 2 customers walked in. An elderly man who came out of habit, and a teenager who wandered in out of curiosity. and left without buying anything. Daniel spent that first week ruining more dough than he managed to save, burning trays he forgot in the oven, undercooking loaves he pulled out too soon, filling the small kitchen with the smell of failure more often than success. He called Evelyn twice that week, apologizing for bothering her, asking questions about proofing times and oven temperatures that she answered patiently over the phone, laughing gently at his mistakes without ever making him feel foolish for asking. He woke at 3 in the morning anyway, every single day, because there was nothing else left for him to build his life around, and because quitting had never once felt like an option worth considering. The apartment above the shop was small and drafty, with a single window that looked out over the quiet street below. And some nights he would sit at that window long after closing, listening to the town settle into silence, wondering if he had made the right decision, or simply the only one available to him. He never let himself dwell there for long. Morning always came early, and there was dough waiting to be shaped whether he felt ready for it or not. He learned by watching old cookbooks, by asking Evelyn questions before she left town to live with her daughter, by trial and by the quiet, grinding patience of a man who had once rebuilt broken supply chains for a living. Slowly, painfully, the bread began to improve. It was during that first difficult month that an older woman, one of his only regular customers, took a bite of a loaf that was still far from perfect and told him something he would remember for years afterward. The first bread he had ever sold her, she said, had been terrible, dense and undercooked and barely edible. But she was going to come back anyway, because she could tell he meant every bit of it. Her name was Ruth, and she had lived on the same street for nearly 40 years, watching businesses open and close along that block more times than she could count. She told him, over that imperfect loaf of bread, that most people who tried to save the old bakery gave up within a month, discouraged by slow mornings and empty tables. What she saw in Daniel, she said, was different, a kind of stubbornness in his eyes that reminded her of people who had already lost everything once and were no longer afraid of losing it again. Daniel did not tell her how right she was. He simply thanked her. And the next morning, he woke at 3 o'clock exactly as he had the day before. Daniel never tried to compete on price, because he knew from the very beginning that price was not what would save the bakery. What he offered instead was something the town had quietly been missing. A shopkeeper who remembered names, who noticed when a regular hadn't come in for a few days, who learned that Mrs. Patterson liked her rye bread slightly darker, and that the Reyes family always bought extra rolls on Sunday mornings. He began setting aside day-old bread for veterans who stopped in on their way to the clinic down the street, quietly discounting orders for the town's underpaid teachers, and pouring free coffee for anyone caught in the rain without an umbrella. He kept a small notebook behind the counter, filling its pages with details most business owners would never think to record, that the man who came in every Tuesday had lost his wife the previous spring and always sat at the same table by the window, that a young mother 2 blocks over could only afford bread on paydays and never on the days in between. He never spoke of these details aloud, and he never made anyone feel seen in a way that embarrassed them. He simply adjusted quietly, an extra roll slipped into a bag without charge. A seat kept open near the window for the man who needed it. Small kindnesses that cost him almost nothing and meant almost everything to the people who received them. Word moved slowly at first, the way it does in small towns, one conversation at a time, one recommendation passed between neighbors who trusted each other's judgment. Then, almost by accident, a young food writer traveling through the region stopped in one afternoon, drawn by the smell drifting out onto the sidewalk, and left with a review that described the bakery as the kind of place that made a stranger feel, for just a few minutes, like he was home again. That single piece of writing reached far more people than Daniel ever expected, and within weeks, cars from towns an hour away began appearing outside his little shop on weekend mornings. The bakery began to change, though its heart never did. Daniel hired his first employee, a young man named Tommy, who had just finished high school and had nowhere else lined up for the fall. And then a second, a woman named Carol, who had spent years working in a diner 2 towns over. He taught them the same care he had taught himself through months of failure, insisting that every loaf leaving the counter meet a standard that had nothing to do with profit margins. He kept doing the small things nobody asked him to do, wiping down every table himself before closing, greeting every customer at the door, remembering that the man in the corner booth had just lost his wife and needed an extra minute of conversation more than he needed his change. By the end of that year, the line outside Brooks Bakery stretched down the block most mornings before the doors had even opened. A quiet, steady queue of people who had found something there that was harder to find almost anywhere else. Tourists began stopping through on their way to somewhere else, and staying longer than they planned, drawn in by a smell that seemed to reach further down the street with every passing month. Daniel never raised his prices to match the demand, and when Tommy asked him once why he didn't, he simply said that the bread was never the point. Only the reason people came back for something else they could not quite name. While Daniel's bread rose in ovens 4 hours away, Victoria Hayes watched her company slowly come apart in ways she could not explain. Profits that had once been reliable began slipping month after month. Product defects climbed on lines that had run smoothly for years under Daniel's watch, and longtime employees began quietly resigning without giving clear reasons why. She noticed the shift, first in small ways, a missed shipment here, a customer complaint there, and told herself each time that it was simply the natural friction of a company adjusting to new leadership after a difficult transition. Whenever she asked Michael Stone about the numbers, he answered with the same calm reassurance every time, telling her that everything was under control, that the fluctuations were temporary, that she had nothing to worry about. She wanted to believe him, because believing him was easier than confronting what she had done, and because questioning him too closely felt uncomfortably close to questioning her own judgment in trusting his evidence 3 years earlier. There were nights she lay awake, wondering whether the decline had begun the same month Daniel left. But she pushed the thought away each time, unwilling to follow it to whatever conclusion waited at the end of it. The numbers kept sliding regardless of what Michael told her. A major investment fund that had backed the company for years began signaling it might pull its support entirely unless leadership could demonstrate a clear plan for recovery. Board meetings grew tense in ways they never had during her father's tenure. Directors exchanging glances across the table whenever quarterly reports came up for discussion, questions about her leadership growing sharper with every passing month. Under pressure from her board, Victoria made a decision that surprised even her closest advisors, choosing to step outside the boardroom entirely and visit small, independently run businesses across the region, hoping to remember what had once made companies like hers succeed in the first place. The first business on the list her assistant handed her was a modest bakery in a town she had never heard of, recommended by a regional partner who described it only as the most talked-about small business in the entire state. Its name meant nothing to her when she first read it printed on the folder. Brooks Bakery, it said, in plain black letters. And Victoria did not yet connect it to the man whose termination letter she had signed 3 years earlier, without asking him a single question. She circled the name on her schedule and told her assistant she would drive out herself, without an entourage, without the usual arrangements that followed her everywhere she went. She arrived on a gray autumn morning, the kind with a light drizzle that clung to car windows and turned fallen leaves slick against the sidewalk. She parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance on foot, something she rarely did anymore. Watching the town unfold around her with its narrow storefronts and hand-painted signs, so different from the glass towers she was used to navigating every day. The bell above the door rang as she stepped inside, and the warmth of the shop wrapped around her immediately. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon thick in the air, soft conversation filling every corner of the small dining space. Behind the counter, a man in a flour-dusted apron was lifting a tray of golden loaves from the oven. His back turned toward the door, entirely unaware of who had just walked in. Victoria stood near the entrance for a moment, taking in the details of the place. The mismatched chairs, the chalkboard menu written in careful handwriting, the framed photographs of the town from decades earlier hanging along one wall. Nothing about it resembled the sterile efficiency of her own offices, and yet something about the space felt more alive than any conference room she had sat in for years. He turned around, and for one long moment, neither of them said a word. Victoria felt the floor tilt beneath her, recognition arriving in a wave that left her unable to speak. While Daniel simply stood there, tray in hand, studying the face he had not seen in 3 years. His expression did not shift into anger the way she braced herself for, nor did it soften into forgiveness she felt she had not yet earned. He simply looked at her the way he looked at anyone new who walked through his door, with quiet, unhurried attention, as though trying to place a familiar face he could not quite name. She braced herself for the words she assumed she deserved. for anger, for questions, for the confrontation she had quietly feared without admitting it to herself. Instead, Daniel set the tray down carefully, wiped his hands on his apron, and offered her the same warm greeting he gave every stranger who walked through his door. "Welcome," he said simply, and nothing more. There was no accusation in his voice, no bitterness hidden beneath the words, only the plain, unguarded kindness he offered to everyone who came into his shop, as though the 10 minutes that had ended his career 3 years earlier belonged to someone else's memory entirely. Victoria did not tell him who she was, not that morning, choosing instead to sit quietly at a small table near the window, while he returned to his work as though nothing unusual had happened at all. She ordered a simple cinnamon loaf and a cup of coffee. And when she took the first bite, something in her chest tightened unexpectedly. Because the bread tasted, impossibly, like the version of her company she remembered from years before she had learned to trust spreadsheets over people. She sat there far longer than she meant to, watching him move between the ovens and the counter, with an ease that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than practice. She watched the way customers greeted him by name, and he greeted them back the same way. Watched an old man limp in on a cane and receive a loaf of bread with no charge at all. Watched 2 children press their faces against the glass display case while their mother apologized, and Daniel simply laughed and handed them each a small roll. None of it looked like a performance. It looked like the ordinary rhythm of a life built entirely around paying attention to other people, something Victoria realized, with a discomfort she could not quite name. She had stopped doing herself somewhere along the way. Before she left, she asked him quietly who had taught him to bake, expecting some story about a mentor or a culinary school she might recognize. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable behind his eyes, and answered with a single word that stayed with her the entire drive home. Failure, he said, had taught him everything he knew. She did not press him further, though the word followed her out the door and into her car, echoing in her mind long after the town had disappeared behind her in the rearview mirror. Victoria did not sleep well that night, replaying the 10 minutes that had ended Daniel's career against the years of quiet decline that had followed his departure. She began, quietly, and without telling anyone at the company, to look back through old records from the time of his termination, searching for something she had missed the first time around. She started with the folder Michael had shown her 3 years earlier, reading it again with a scrutiny she had not bothered to apply the first time, and almost immediately, small inconsistencies began surfacing that she had been too rushed, or too eager to appear decisive, to notice before. What she found unsettled her more with every passing hour. Spreadsheets with formulas altered days after they were supposedly submitted. Emails with timestamps that did not match the servers they claimed to originate from, a signature on one crucial document that, upon closer inspection, did not match Daniel's handwriting at all. She spent several nights alone in her office, long after the building had emptied, comparing document after document under the harsh light of her desk lamp, feeling something cold settle in her stomach with each new discrepancy she uncovered. By the 3rd night, she no longer doubted that something had gone terribly wrong, only that she had been the one who allowed it to happen. She hired a discreet financial investigator, someone outside the company who owed her no loyalty, and could be trusted to follow the evidence wherever it led. Weeks passed as the investigator quietly traced the falsified records back through layers of disguised transactions, cross-referencing supplier contracts against internal approvals that had supposedly come from Daniel's office. Every thread eventually led to the same place, back to Michael Stone, whose signature appeared on documents he had never officially filed, whose personal accounts showed deposits that matched, almost exactly, the sums missing from company contracts over several years. Victoria sat with the finished report for a long time before she could bring herself to read it twice. She remembered the meeting where she had fired Daniel, remembered how quickly she had accepted the folder of evidence in front of her, without asking a single question, remembered the look on his face when he realized she was not going to listen. For the first time in years, she recognized her own arrogance clearly, the certainty she had mistaken for good leadership, the confidence that had allowed her to end a man's career without pausing long enough to consider that he might be innocent. She thought about the years he had spent rebuilding a bakery from nothing, while she had spent those same years defending a decision built entirely on lies. While all of this unfolded behind closed doors 4 hours away, Daniel knew none of it. His mornings had not changed at all, beginning as they always did at 4 o'clock. the town still dark and quiet around him, while he moved through the familiar rhythm of lighting the ovens, measuring flour, and preparing the first batch of bread before the sun had fully risen. He had built a life that no longer depended on approval from anyone in a boardroom. And he had stopped, somewhere along the way, expecting the truth about his firing to ever surface at all. He simply worked, and taught Tommy and Carol a little more each day, and let the town continue discovering his shop one visitor at a time. The board meeting that followed was unlike any Hayes Food Group had held in years. Victoria stood before the assembled directors and laid out the investigation in careful, deliberate detail, presenting evidence that left little room for doubt about who had truly been responsible for the losses that had nearly sunk the company. She spoke without notes, her voice steady even as she described her own failure to question the evidence that had ended Daniel's career, refusing to soften her own role in what had happened, simply because it would have been easier to do so. Michael Stone denied everything at first, his voice rising with practiced indignation, insisting the documents had been manipulated to frame him, that Victoria was simply looking for someone to blame for her own failures as chief executive. Daniel had been asked to attend, and he arrived carrying a worn leather folder he had kept for 3 years, without ever expecting to open it in front of anyone again. He had almost thrown it away more than once during the hard, early months of the bakery, when the past felt like something better left behind entirely. But something had always stopped him at the last moment. Inside were the personal work logs he had maintained every single day of his employment, records of every approval he had actually given, every meeting he had actually attended, every decision that could be verified against dates and details Michael could never have anticipated needing to forge. When Daniel laid the pages across the table, one by one, the discrepancies became impossible to explain away. Each entry, lining up precisely against the falsified records the investigator had already uncovered. The room fell silent as the truth settled over everyone present, and within minutes, Michael's composure cracked entirely, his denials collapsing into a stammering attempt to shift blame that convinced no one left in the room. Security was called, and Michael Stone was escorted from the building he had spent years quietly defrauding. His career ending in far less dignity than the man he had once destroyed. The board members sat in stunned silence, some staring at Daniel with something close to shame. Others simply unable to process how thoroughly they had been deceived for so long. One director, an older man who had known Daniel for most of his career, rose from his seat and quietly apologized on behalf of the entire board. His voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide. Daniel accepted the apology with the same quiet grace he brought to everything, thanking them for finally listening, though the years the truth had cost him could never be returned, no matter how sincerely the apology was offered. Victoria stood before them once the room had settled and did something none of them had ever seen her do before, lowering her head slightly as she addressed the board directly. The man she should have trusted, she told them quietly, was the very man she had fired without asking a single question, and no apology from her could undo what those 3 years had cost him. It was the first time in her career she had admitted, publicly and without excuse, that she had been wrong, and the words seemed to cost her something real to speak aloud, something she had spent years protecting behind titles and boardroom confidence. She drove to the bakery again the following week. This time, without calling ahead. Without the folder of business proposals she usually carried into every meeting. The town was quiet, under a light frost, the trees nearly bare. The bell above the bakery door ringing the same way it always did as she stepped inside. She did not Instead, she joined the line like every other customer, standing behind an elderly woman and a young mother with a stroller, waiting her turn the way she had never once waited for anything in her professional life. When she finally reached the counter, she did not offer a prepared statement or a rehearsed explanation. She simply looked at Daniel and told him, plainly, that she was sorry, not just for the meeting that had ended his career, but for every year afterward that she had never once thought to question what she had done. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke, and she did not try to steady it, letting him see, for the first time since she had known him, something other than the composed executive he had once reported to. Daniel listened without interrupting, wiping his hands slowly on his apron, as he considered what to say in return. He told her something that surprised her more than anything else that day. He had never hated her. He said quietly, not once, not even in the hardest months, when he was burning trays alone at 3 in the morning, with nothing left to his name. He explained, gently, that hatred would have cost him something he could not afford to lose during those difficult years, that he had chosen instead to put every ounce of that anger into flour and yeast and long mornings, and that somewhere along the way, the anger had simply stopped mattering to him. Victoria felt something break loose in her chest that she had been holding for weeks, and for the first time in longer than she could remember. She let herself cry in front of someone she could not control the outcome with. It was not a business apology or a calculated gesture meant to repair a public image. It was simply the truth, finally spoken aloud, and Daniel received it the same quiet way he received everything, without judgment, without demanding more than she was able to give. When the board later offered to reinstate him with a position higher than the one he had lost, Daniel declined without hesitation, telling Victoria gently that he had already found the place where he truly belonged. In the months that followed, Victoria found herself returning to the bakery more often than business alone could explain, arriving sometimes before the sun had even risen, standing quietly in the kitchen, while Daniel taught her things no business degree had ever prepared her for. She learned to knead dough with her whole body, instead of just her hands. Learned to listen for the sound bread makes when it is finally ready to leave the oven. Learned to remember a customer's name after hearing it only once. Daniel taught her patiently, without ever once mentioning the company she still technically ran, treating her simply as someone willing to learn. At first, her hands were clumsy against the dough, too tense, too accustomed to controlling outcomes rather than working with something as unpredictable as yeast and time. Daniel would place his hands gently over hers to correct her grip, telling her that bread, unlike quarterly earnings, could not be rushed or pressured into behaving the way she wanted it to. She laughed at herself more in those early mornings than she had in years. Flour dusted across her sleeves, her carefully styled hair coming loose, as she leaned over the counter, trying to master a fold Tommy could execute in seconds. For the first time in her career, Victoria began to understand something that had never appeared in any quarterly report she had ever read: that a business built entirely around numbers would always be fragile, while one built around genuine care for the people it served could survive almost anything. She began applying small lessons from the bakery back at her own company, taking time to learn the names of employees she had only ever known by department, sitting in on shifts at the factory floor the way Daniel once had, listening more than she instructed. The changes were small at first, but the company's culture began to shift in ways that no consultant's report had ever managed to achieve. A journalist eventually caught wind of her regular visits to the small-town bakery and wrote a piece describing the unlikely transformation of a powerful young executive into a woman, quietly learning to bake bread beside the man she had once fired. The story spread further than either of them expected, carried from one conversation to another across the country, until Brooks Bakery became known not just for its bread, but for the story of honesty and grace that had grown up around it. People began traveling from other states just to see the shop for themselves, to sit at the same worn tables, to understand what had drawn a corporate executive back to a small-town bakery week after week. Daniel never courted the attention, and he continued treating every new customer with the same quiet warmth he had shown on the day the shop had only 2 visitors. He turned down offers from magazines wanting exclusive interviews, and he politely declined a proposal to franchise the bakery's name across several states, telling the interested investors that some things were never meant to be multiplied beyond what one person could personally hold together with their own 2 hands. Victoria understood that instinct better than anyone, having spent years chasing growth for its own sake, only to learn from him that some of the most valuable things in life resisted scale entirely. A year later, Victoria sold a significant portion of her shares in Hayes Food Group and used the proceeds to establish a fund dedicated to supporting small, family-run businesses across the country, the kind of businesses that rarely received attention from investors who only understood spreadsheets. She named the fund quietly, without ceremony, choosing instead to let its work speak for itself the way Daniel's bread once had. One struggling shop at a time, one family kept afloat instead of foreclosed upon. Daniel, meanwhile, opened 3 additional locations of his bakery in neighboring towns. Though he insisted on personally working the ovens at the original shop every single morning, unwilling to let go of the routine that had rebuilt his life from nothing, Victoria still arrived early most days, long before the shop opened to customers, standing quietly beside him while the ovens warmed in the dark. Some mornings they spoke very little, content simply to work side by side in comfortable silence. The kind that only grows between two people who have already said the hardest things there were to say. Other mornings, she asked him questions about the years he had spent alone in the apartment above the shop. And he answered honestly, without flinching, letting her carry a small piece of the weight he had once carried entirely by himself. One winter morning, with frost tracing delicate patterns across the front windows and the street outside still empty and silent, Daniel handed her a fresh loaf still warm from the oven and asked her a question he had been considering for weeks. This time, he asked softly, would she like to open the shop with him every morning, not as an investor, not as a visitor passing through, but as someone who belonged there permanently? Victoria looked at him for a long moment, a small, uncertain smile forming at the corner of her mouth, and asked if he was inviting her back into the company she once ran. Daniel shook his head slowly, setting the loaf down between them on the counter. No, he told her. He was inviting her home. The words settled between them quietly, without any of the fanfare that once accompanied every major decision in the boardrooms she had spent her career inside. And Victoria realized, standing there in the dim early light with flour still dusted across her sleeves, that this small, unremarkable moment meant more to her than any merger or acquisition she had ever signed her name to. The door opened not long after, and the smell of warm bread drifted out onto the quiet street, curling past the frost-covered windows and into the cold morning air. Customers began arriving one after another. The same familiar faces that had kept the shop alive through its hardest years, filling the small space with quiet conversation and the comfortable warmth of a place that had earned its reputation one loaf at a time. Ruth arrived, just as she always did, taking her usual seat by the window, nodding once at Daniel and once at Victoria, as though the sight of them working the counter together was simply the natural order of things now. The bakery that had once stood on the edge of closing forever had become something far greater than either Daniel or Victoria could have imagined on the day they first crossed paths again, a place people traveled to not only for the bread, but for the story woven quietly into every corner of it, a story about honesty that refused to break, and forgiveness that finally found its way home. Tommy and Carol had grown into skilled bakers in their own right, training newer employees the same way Daniel had once trained them, passing along not just technique, but the quiet philosophy that had built the shop from nothing. Losing everything, Daniel had once believed, was the end of the road he had spent 20 years building. It turned out instead to be the beginning of a much better one, a road that led him not backward toward what he had lost, but forward toward exactly where he was always meant to be. Forgiveness could not undo the years that had already passed, could not return the time or the trust that had been taken from him without warning, but it could still open a door to something neither of them had expected, a future built not on numbers or titles, but on the simple, steady truth that had guided Daniel through every difficult morning since the day he lost everything and chose, quietly, to begin again.